Hey, have you ever noticed when you're talking to someone online in a political fashion that they might answer, "You only have feelings, you don't have any real arguments"? If you're on the left, you probably hear this a lot. There's this idea on online forums that the left can only reason and talk about feelings while the right deals with cold, hard facts. And why is it that some people reject obvious facts and the teachings of our Lord SOBEK, who rules over the flat vaccine Earth with the help of communist lizard people? Let's talk about that. Today I want to delve into an ideology that has captured the attention of many people: anti-intellectualism. It's an ideology that has reared its head in many different forms, many of whom you are probably familiar with. And anti-intellectualism, according to me at least, is pretty much everywhere at this point. But why is that? And how do we fix that? Before I delve into this fascinating ideology, I do want to make some points clear that I feel are critical to understanding anti-intellectualism. First off, when I refer to anti-intellectualism as an ideology, I'm not meaning it as something that you actively subscribe to. I merely mean a shared set of ideas that constitute a worldview that is shared among all anti-intellectuals. You may not want to be an anti-intellectual, but if you believe in certain things, and if you act in certain things, and if you have a certain worldview, that can be categorized as anti-intellectual. I very much doubt a lot of people actually call themselves anti-intellectuals. Second of all, by anti-intellectual, I don't mean dumb or uneducated. Anti-intellectualism can rear its head even within top tiers of academia, and pretty much anywhere. In fact, there are many people who, by any definition, would be considered smart people who make a living of being anti-intellectuals, mostly by being morons online. And third of all, anti-intellectualism is an umbrella term that encompasses many different types of anti-intellectual discourse. While there is a strong argument to be made that these ideologies are separate and distinct from each other, my theory is that these ideologies share very common factors that are rooted in similar ways of thinking. I believe that they are merely expressing themselves in different ways depending on the values of the person expressing them and the field in question. For example, climate change denial is merely anti-intellectualism in action when it comes to climate science. The anti-vaccination movement is simply anti-intellectualism in action in medical science. Okay, anti-vaccination, climate change denial, a myriad of other anti-intellectualist outlets. Obviously bad things, right? So how do we fix that? Well, that was the topic of a lecture that I attended roughly 5 to 6 years ago. I should say that at the time, I was fairly convinced by the arguments, but today I have a very different perspective. But we'll deal with that later. The subject of the lecture was, how do we maintain scientific integrity? Or how do we make sure that not everyone is going around not respecting the science that we produce? The solution proposed was something called professionalism, which probably has another meaning depending on where you heard it, but that's what I heard it, and my opinion is the only correct one, so that's what I'm gonna call it. Professionalism. Basically, the gist of it was that if a profession is seen as exclusive and hard to reach, the science gained within that profession will be more respected. I can see where this is coming from. I'm not gonna argue with an astrophysicist over the finer points of stellar constellation creation. That's not something that I understand, because, well, I'm not an astrophysicist. The science produced from these exclusive professions are more seen as established facts. But that's not because they are more respected necessarily, but rather because it's hard to understand the facts and the science that field produces. Conversely, if a scientific field is seen as something that anyone could do by spending 10 minutes on Wikipedia, then science produced by professionals within that field, their science wouldn't be as respected anymore. And, you know, that's understandable. But this creates a dilemma, right? How much can you disseminate science and information to the general public without that profession becoming more generic, or the value of that profession becoming less worth. In theory, if science was more available to everyone, that would make it more possible for people to be amateur scientists, which my professor at the time and many other in academia at that lecture saw as really bad. Only we can do science! But it wasn't necessarily about science. It could be about any profession. Professionalism in this context tells us that not everyone can be an astrophysicist, not everyone can become an historian, and not everyone can become a mechanic. Like, I'm not gonna argue with the mechanic over how they fix my car, because I don't know shit. I never studied car science. And the point was that science could come from anywhere, but unless it's very rigid and monitored, coming from specific frameworks, that science might not be up to snuff. We still have to respect scientists. The point was that we still have to respect that some people will know more than others. Otherwise, they said, we would get things like this. The ideal is that there would be some sort of balance between general education of the sciences, but still the professionality of those who produce that science. But that balance doesn't currently exist, right? And that's partially because of how science is currently produced, but also how science is received by the mainstream media. But as I said before, I don't agree with this idea of professionalism necessarily being the solution to anti-intellectualism. Just saying, just listen to experts, they know better and you probably couldn't do it if you tried, isn't really something that's going to include people to trust you as a science producer. Scientist. Personally, I believe that anyone could produce amazing knowledge or create amazing science, and sometimes it is the outside perspective that is outside of academia and outside of the rigid framework that we currently have that allows for such discoveries. Having science and knowledge be this exclusive club for the few is not really something that will let the general public trust the people who produce the science. If anything, I believe it pushes people away from you, and more often than not, into the arms of those who would gladly welcome anyone to believe in them. Like conspiracy theorists. I don't believe that professionalism will ever strike that balance between exclusivity, professionalism, but still being able to communicate with the general public about the science that they produce. My theory is that there will never be a balance. And mostly that's fine. And sure, climate scientists, they definitely do know more than most people when it comes to climate science. No one is really arguing that point. Surely, we are rationals here on YouTube. Surely we, the skeptics, we focus on facts. Facts don't care about your feelings. A large part of why some people focus so much on specific data points or studies or similar things is because of something that I like to call the science fetish. This is where you adore the idea of science without actually adopting the principles that the science demands.
Men tend to be interested in things and women tend to be interested in people. And there's some decent evidence that thing interest is mediated by testosterone exposure in utero, which sounds pretty biological, all things considered. And you know, I've made the claim that in my classes that I don't buy the distinction between sex and gender, which was invented by John Money.
This means that data, studies, statistics are only relevant to you when they confirm your ideas. And when they don't, they are considered pseudo-academic or pseudo-scientific.
Back in 1955, a single theorist, and whose ideas I think were quite badly discredited, especially by his involvement in the Johns Hopkins Gender Reassignment Clinic, which shut down just a few years ago. That was his baby, and they decided that gender reassignment surgery was a catastrophe.
Some people apply this so liberally that it could apply to anything that doesn't sync up with their own worldview already. This is why some people adore the phrase, "facts don't care about your feelings," in almost all contexts, even in contexts where it's not even relevant to the discussion at hand. It is potentially a fact that the sky is blue, but only under certain contexts, and in many contexts saying that the sky is blue would just be harmful and destructive. It wouldn't really contribute anything to the science. Telling an astronomer that the sky is blue would not really help the astronomer do anything. This is despite the fact that in most commonly understood situations, saying that the sky is blue would be an obvious fact. It's technically correct, but it's not actually useful for the discussion at hand. This happens often to people who fetishize so-called hard science. Hard, like a block of wood. The science of wood. However, similar things can be said of people who fetishize the pursuit of philosophical or theoretical fields of science, or fields of science that are more commonly referred to as soft science. Like some water in a bottle. Fluid. Ever-changing. Like a liquid of knowledge. This is why most anti-intellectuals don't necessarily reject science as a concept. Rather, they have a distrust of the institutions that produce that science. In the anti-intellectual mindset, these institutions have a de facto monopoly on knowledge and science. And if you don't trust those institutions, then anything that the entire sphere of institutions say is distrustful at best. And this is where you get lines like Big Pharma. All of this is caused by a distrust of the institutions that produce the science. If academia and science is so good, and society has changed so much in the last 100 years thanks to science, then why is everything still crap? Why am I living a hard life? Why do I have trouble feeding my family? Why are the world leaders bad? People see that things aren't really going that well for a lot of people, but critically, not specifically for the people who are in the institutions themselves. For them, things seem pretty good. Things are awful everywhere, but not seemingly for the members of the institutions that tell us things are good. The academics, the coastal elites. The gut reaction, which isn't necessarily that misplaced, is that these institutions are abusing the frameworks that are meant for the general good, but only for themselves, and for their own personal gain. And this is, in many cases, true. We have corrupt politicians, corrupt bankers. In the mindset of the anti-intellectual, the banker, politician, and academic aren't necessarily very different people. They are all part of the establishment. From this context, it's easy to see why some people would use the framework that is meant for the common good and simply do it themselves. If the establishment won't do it, then I sure will. It's not necessarily that these people are dumb or egotistical. Some people are genuinely trying to share good knowledge and make the world a better place, and trying to save it from the people who abuse the scientific process for their own gains. However, many are abusive actors in this scenario, using the distrust of established institutions to sell products and to make themselves richer. There are many people who have chosen to not try to reform the institutions that they believe are corrupt, but rather create their own. Within that context, flaws sometimes occur, and that's okay. You haven't had 1,000 years of academic foundation to build on, you're starting from scratch. So any flaws that seemingly are discovered can be explained away with inexperience or institutional meddling. If your new alternative to big pharma is failing, you can blame that on many other things, and the flaws that are presented are often downplayed. At this point, I feel like I have to admit something. I was one of these people. I was an anti-vaxxer teen, and I was a 9/11 truther. But what changed? Well, I went to university. The lessons that I learned in history class didn't necessarily apply to if steel beams could melt and vaccination medicine. The scientific process that I learned, however, was something that I could apply to my life. I could examine myself and the knowledge that I thought I had. It's what made me who I am today. This surely means that the solution to anti-intellectualism has to be in the democratic process. If everyone can do science, if everyone like me can have the scientific method as a part of their lives, then surely anti-intellectualism will slowly go away. My theory is that the opposite would and has occurred. I present to you the History Channel.
They've thought it best to use members of the human population.
They could have imparted that information to Joan of Arc to give her the confidence that ultimately led her military campaign to victory.
And close encounters that leave behind mysterious clues to our past and our future.
Shows like these distribute a fictionalized version of the scientific process as entertainment to the general public. And even in the best of scenarios, you can't really make the scientific process fun or interesting to watch on TV. At least not without being extremely boring. These formats can be extremely helpful. They can inspire people to partake in scientific literature or take part in any scientific field. I also want to study ancient aliens. This happens a lot in history, because history is easily repackaged as an entertainment product rather than as a scientific field. And this often inspires people sometimes to grow an interest in history. However, more often than not, something else happens. A lot of the time you get people who fetishize the concept of history. These are the people who go into the bachelor program loving tanks, right-wing extremism, Hitler. Hang on. Most of these people rarely continue further into the field, as they discover that the actual science of it all isn't really as it was presented watching the great tanks of World War II. But for people who don't pursue an education and don't have this experience, or for people who simply do their own research and end up on the wrong way, they have a very different experience. Without a broad variety of contexts and viewpoints, this could be more scientifically dangerous than anything else. Instead of leading the person into a balanced and checked system, it's very likely that the person can have gaps in their understanding, which can be filled with either their own biases or the biases of someone else. If someone else is putting in their own bias, they usually have a political agenda. I'm not saying that everyone who watches Ancient Aliens has to get a degree in history in order to understand the field. I am saying that without a framework or a context, people can be easily persuaded into believing conspiracy theories or flat-out pseudoscience. Even within academic circles with a lot of checks and balances, there is a lot of potential for your own biases to seep into your research. If you lack the framework and the checks and balances, this becomes even more likely. This isn't necessarily intentional. Many people sometimes produce false data simply by accident, because they haven't understood a certain perspective or lack a perspective that is critical to the understanding of the field that they're studying. This isn't done by malice, and it happens a lot of time within academic circles too. The difference in academic circles is that there's a lot of more people who will check your work and eliminate those mistakes and biases. That doesn't really exist if all the research you do is on Wikipedia. And I should say that I don't necessarily believe that democratization of science is a bad thing. I think it's an incredibly good thing that can do a lot of social good. I do however think that without a context and without a framework, it becomes a dangerous tool that can be misused. It's popular today to diss on academia, and believe me, I love dissing on academia. But it does provide a framework within which you can do fairly good science. It's just that a lot of people just don't do that. When it works well, academic circles and research groups work better when they are constantly under criticism, which is what they should be. I'm not saying that traditional education is the only viewpoint and the only framework, but I am saying that it is a framework that most of us have access to. I'm not saying that academia is the best kind of framework, nor am I saying that it is the only kind of framework. I am saying that without any framework, it's very easy for conspiracy theorists to grab a hold of the research that has no context. Without a context, it's easy for a prospective audience to fill in the gaps themselves using their own biases, or for someone with a political or commercial agenda to fill in those gaps too. And this is how you get the really dangerous parts of anti-intellectualism. Holocaust denial, climate change denial, anti-vaxxing movements. So how do we fix that? Well, the easy answer is education. Funding education needs to be one of the top priorities for any political movement that wants to counteract the wave of anti-intellectualism. That means that schools, high schools, universities, libraries, and all kinds of educational venues have to be more accessible and readily available. When these work well, they provide a fundamental framework that rarely limits the exploration of the self and the exploration of your own research, while combating the most basic flaws that most research can create. But this isn't a permanent fix. Unless that education keeps up with changes in society, we are right back at square one. New biases that are created as society evolves will be able to seep into the more outdated education systems, and then education isn't as valuable anymore. And even when a well-funded education system works really well, it will not work 100% of the time. That just won't happen. There will always be people who are lost causes and people who will flat out reject any science that doesn't conform with their own worldview. However, that's actually fine. As I said before, I don't think the balance will ever exist. And that's fine. We live in a society, and that means the system doesn't have to work 100% of the time, as long as it works most of the time. We live in a society. We live in a society. I got the stains. There's so much stains on my floors. Okay, so this video has been going on a while now, and you probably think, what does this have to do with left or right discourse? What does this have to do with anything really outside of, you know, fringe YouTube circles and Facebook groups? Well, anti-intellectualism has its effects in real life too, and that's why I'm on the floor, more grounded to reality. For example, what happens within a field when anti-intellectualism within the field becomes more mainstream than the established field itself? Well, I know that was a big word soup, but this has already happened, and it's something that is a danger to both institutions, academics, students, and followers of the field. I'm talking about gender studies. Gender studies institutions and academics and thinkers and writers are all facing many different kinds of hardships, partly from governmental issues, partly from social outcry on the internet, and also from bomb threats in certain cases. This has of course happened in conjunction with the more and more mainstream idea that gender studies is not a real science. That is SJW mumbo jumbo with a bunch of lesbians and unlimited amount of genders. Most of the criticism I hear against gender studies are things that you would in many other circumstances deem as blatantly anti-intellectual. It's trying to promote feminism as this divine interventionist religion thing, But the people who say that, and most people who criticize gender studies, actually have no idea what gender studies even is. But that doesn't stop them from being critical of it. If you go online to search for criticism against gender studies, you can find tons of anecdotal evidence, but that's also the case for pretty much every single scientific field. The reason that gender studies gets a hard rap is because, well, some people have an agenda against gender studies because of false preconceived notions about what it is, or because of anti-intellectualism, like, you know, the thing I'm talking about in this video. One of the reasons gender studies is one of the focuses of modern day, more mainstream anti-intellectualism is simply because it gets more reported on. It's more popular to talk about gender studies as a concept, and it's also more popular to rail against gender studies as a concept. And if you know YouTube, you know that a lot of people have kind of made a living out of being against things. Now, you may think I'm defending gender studies as a concept here. I'm actually not. I'm more criticizing the unfair treatment that gender studies get. It's not like I'm seeing bomb threats go out to shady psychological courses. Like, that doesn't really happen in the same degree. Now, there are some people who will probably comment on this video saying that, well, the reason that people dislike gender studies is because you can't get a job in it. And I really hope that those people have the exact same problems with a lot of other scientific fields, where you can't get a job. It should also be noted that getting a job within academia is a job. If your problem with gender studies is that it doesn't lead to a real job, then I hope that you have the exact same criticism for most academic fields. You could very well argue that being an astrophysicist isn't a real job because it doesn't actually contribute to anyone in society. It's just science for the sake of science. And I would argue that gender studies is similar, but in a different way. But what do you care? Like, this is probably still just some fringe group on the internet, and maybe it rears its head going against certain academic fields, but it doesn't actually impact the normal everyday existence of our lives, does it? Well, I'm sorry to tell you that some of your favorite people are probably a little bit anti-intellectualist. And so am I. Within political discourse, there is a clear pattern between how the left and how the right argue within themselves and with each other. In general, you can say that there is a theoretical way of arguing and a materialist way of arguing, and both of these types of arguing exist across the political spectrum. However, there are patterns, and you have probably heard of some of these before. Facts versus feelings. Emotions versus logic. Or rather, it's the idea of facts versus feelings. It's no secret that the left loves to have philosophical and theoretical arguments a lot, and it's no coincidence that some of the bigger voices within leftist circles currently are philosophers. My father and, of course, Dark Mother. And before I go any further, I should say that I adore their content a lot. However, sometimes within very philosophical or theoretical discussions, it's easy to become too abstract. And when you become too abstract, it's easy to get lost within the theory and miss critical perspectives. This is the cause for many of my disagreements with Contrapoints and the fabled aesthetics video, which will not be mentioned again. That's not to say that there's no knowledge or wisdom to be gained from having those discussions. There is, and it's very good knowledge and it should be valued. However, it's easy to lose critical aspects of your ideology when you're only worried about being theoretically coherent within the theory itself. This is why it's not uncommon to see dozens of leftist groups fighting each other over small trivialities of differences within the ideology, when practically they could just have a little compromise and have much more practical impact on the real world. We do love our philosophy discussions. Of course, these kinds of discussions happen within right-wing circles too, but they're not as mainstream as they are within leftist circles. Capitalists aren't really arguing what kind of capitalism they should do, they just do capitalist things. And I mean, come on. We left-wingers, we love our theories. But at least this is better than the right-wing science fetish. A fetish which takes facts as some kind of absolute unit of scientific measurement. And I can't even get into why facts are mostly socially constructed anyway. unless we're talking about the most fundamental parts of the universe, and even then I'm kind of sketchy. The right wing is obsessed with facts and statistics and individual reports, which could potentially give their side or their argument some credence or substance. But as any trans person on the internet knows, this doesn't really extend to the level that it should. Similarly to how the left can often over-rely on theory, the right has a tendency of over-relying on facts, or rather, factoids. Seeing right-wing commentators talking about facts, you can see that they only take in the facts that support their own argument, and totally ignore everything else as pseudoscience or SJW bullshit. The problem here is a lack of theoretical context. Being able to put facts into perspective and into a context is critical to actually understanding what the facts mean. Of course, there is value in those discussions too. Data gathering is one of the most important bits of material science, but without a theoretical framework, it just becomes nothing. It's a bunch of bricks that you could build a house with, but right now it's just a bunch of bricks. I would say that the over-reliance on facts and statistics without context is probably more dangerous to society than an over-reliance on theory, simply because the society we live in currently does value facts and statistics more than it values theoretical arguments. And you know, that sucks, and it really sucks and shouldn't be like that, but that's the way the world lives in, and I can't fix everything, okay? While I assign a pattern between the left and the right on this, both of these kinds of over-reliances can be found in both sides of the political spectrum. Neither of these problems are exclusive to either sector of the political spectrum. They exist everywhere, and it's a problem everywhere. But at least currently, there is a pattern that exists. Thinkers and philosophers on the left do currently prefer these fluidly but coherent within themselves explanations, while other thinkers prefer these hard and blocky explanations. I'm not saying that there should be a balance between the political ideologies, because I'm a leftist, and what I am saying is that in the pursuit of knowledge, we need to balance these two. We need to balance the liquid, fluid explanations of ideology, philosophy, and theory with the material, hard, blocky science of facts. If we want to push the frontiers of leftist discourse while also working against anti-intellectualism, we need to merge the wooden, hard nature of facts and science and statistics with the fluid and liquid nature of philosophy and theoretical arguments. We need to merge these ideas into a balanced, sweet and thick, viscous liquid. Something that we can all take care of. This was so bad. Why did I do this? I'm just dripping in syrup. This was a really bad idea. Why did I do this? I want to give a special shout out to Kim, Abraham Aldridge, Ryan Kolak, Emma, not Goldman. I'm not super sure how to pronounce your name, so I'm sorry if I did something wrong. Let me know and I'll fix it. Dan Sinfield, William Pietri, again I'm awful with names. Christopher Steinmuller, I should be able to pronounce that one since it's very close to my own name. Thank you all for being great fans and subscribers. If you want to see more of my content, you can subscribe to my channel, and you can leave a comment, you can like the video. If you do leave a comment, I try to respond to most of them, as long as you're nice to me. If you want to give me financial support, you can do that on Patreon at patreon.com/MiaMulder. Every donation really does help in my conquest to take over the world with my plans. Why? Why have I done this? This is the dumbest shit I've ever done. I just want to be part of like the left tube circle where they put liquids on each other. And why did I pick honey of all things? It's the hardest thing to clean up. And it's past midnight. I have no idea how to do this. Like, I need to go. I'm so sorry.